Uh, yeah, I'm clearly audible, guys. Priyanka? Yeah, so I think we'll start. Whoever joins later, we'll just add them in. Yeah. So today we'll be starting our talks on the respiratory physiology of the baby, and we'll be discussing respiratory distress syndrome. As you know, one of the most common reasons why a preterm baby gets admitted in an NICU. So what we are doing is the respiratory physiology of a baby by itself is very vast. So rather than taking an entire session discussing every smallest nook and corner of the respiratory physiology is going to be very taxing. So what we'll be doing is whenever we are discussing one by one the various pathologies, then we'll discuss the physiology which will be related to it. So today, because we are discussing RDS, our main focus on the physiological part will be on the embryology of the respiratory system in a fetus, and majorly focusing on the surfactant system. So I think let's just start with it. Yeah. So basically, what are we talking about when we say breathing and respiration? So I am sure everyone knows that there is a major difference between these two terms. So breathing is basically a mechanical process where air moves in and out of the lung. So breathing also it is known as ventilation. So either it can be a spontaneous breathing baby, or we are giving mechanical ventilation to the child, whether invasive or non-invasive. The entire process is breathing. Respiration, on the other hand, is the actual transport of oxygen from the outside air to the cells within the tissues, and whatever metabolism which goes in along with that, the transport of carbon dioxide out of the body. So this entire molecular level physiology which happens is respiration. Now, what is important is that there is a transition from fetal to neonatal life, and this requires a rapid conversion from the intermittent fetal respiratory activity, which is not actually associated with gas exchange, because as we know, the fetus receives all the oxygen nutrition requirements from the placenta directly. So the respiratory activity is not a very targeted respiratory activity, and it is intermittent. So a conversion from this kind of activity to a continuous breathing upon which the gas exchange is dependent occurs suddenly. The transition is very sudden. So we'll discuss what exactly are the issues that happens when this transition occurs in a preterm baby, as against yeah, as against a full-term neonate. So before we move on to even the surfactant production, this is the basic embryology that we need to know. So this we are talking about the embryonic part of the lung development, the embryonic stage of the lung development, which occurs between around 4th to 7th, 8th week. Here, as we can see, the laryngotracheal tube is formed through which we get bilaterally tracheal buds formation. The tracheal buds further bifurcate and form their bronchial buds. So here we get the bronchial development, and later on there is the parenchyma which develops around it. By 8 weeks itself, we get the 3 lobes of right lung and 2 lobes of left lung, which are rudimentarily formed. Now, why this stage is important? Because as you can see that the esophagus and the tracheal separation also occurs in this phase. So whatever goes wrong here, we can have the baby with a tracheoesophageal fistula, which is very important. So now that we discussed that this is the embryonic stage of the lung development. So we need to know the different stages in which the lung actually develops. So those are the 5 stages. The mnemonic that I had made, because initially it was difficult to remember, was that every person can say alphabets. So every person can say alphabet means the first stage is embryonic, then comes your pseudoglandular stage, can is canalicular, S is saccular, and then comes the alveolar stage. What we need to remember is alveolar stage is roughly from 36 weeks of gestation till going around 7 to 8 years of life of the child. And so majority of the part of your surfactant formation and everything occurs before this, that is till the saccular stage. Now if you can see here, the embryonic period, we have the embryonic stage of development. This is the stage which we already discussed in our last slide, that there is a formation of the lung bud, then the tracheal buds, the bronchial buds. From this, that is the structural development takes place here around 3 to 6 7 weeks of gestation. By the 7th week, we start our pseudoglandular phase of lung development. Now, what happens in pseudoglandular stage is that the lung parenchyma is now developing around those bronchial and tracheal buds. So, just a second. Yeah. The most important thing that occurs in the pseudoglandular stage here is that we have the formation of something called type 2 pneumocytes. We'll be discussing what is type 1 and what is type 2 pneumocytes. What we need to remember is type 2 pneumocytes are the one which are related to a formation of surfactant in any baby. So as you can see, it is roughly 2 to months that we are talking about. That is roughly 3 to 6 weeks is the embryonic period. Then say around 4th month of gestation, that is maybe around your 16 17 weeks of gestation, your pseudoglandular stage is finished. Starting from your 17th week of gestation, what we have is our canalicular stage of lung development. Now, in the canalicular stage, if you see, already the bronchial tree formation has occurred, already the parenchyma has occurred. So the finishing work, that is the formation of the lung periphery, formation of the vascularization, and the air-blood interface, the fine-tuning of all this thing actually occurs in your canalicular and the saccular stage. So as you can see, there is a type 1 pneumocytes appearance in the canalicular stage. Now type 1 pneumocytes, when we are talking about, these are this form major part of the pneumocytes, that is around 95 to 96% of our pneumocytes are type 1 and around 4 to 5% are type 2. As I already said, type 2 pneumocytes are concerned with the formation of surfactant in our baby, and type 1 pneumocytes are actually responsible for all the structural and the metabolic changes which occur in the lung tissue. So this starts around 17th week of gestation and roughly is completed by 27th week of gestation. Also the vascularization and all those things occurs during this stage. Now when our baby reaches the 27th week of gestation, here the alveolar saccule start forming. So this is the final stage of the lung development, because the maturity of the alveoli will be going on, as I said, for the first few years of life postnatally. But the formation, the basic formation happens in your saccular stage. This is the stage where there is a detectable surfactant level in amniotic fluid. So now as you can see, whenever we have a baby who is born preterm, depending on what is the gestational age at birth of the baby will be the developmental arrest which happens. So say a baby is born at 30 weeks of gestation, we have the baby in saccular stage but somewhere in mid of it. So obviously there will be surfactant which is already started forming, but the majority of surfactant development, as you can see, occurs in the third trimester of gestation. So this baby will be deficient in the total quantity of surfactant, and that is why we have the baby presenting to us with signs of respiratory distress, and what we term it as RDS. So these are the important embryological concepts about the lung that we have to remember before we even think about the pathology. So now that we are clear about this and we know that the type 2 pneumocyte, that is the surfactant production, begins somewhere around here and continues till here, and depending on the maturity of the baby, the prematurity of the baby, we have the deficiency of surfactant. Now coming to what exactly comes into your pulmonary surfactant. Now, I'll be very frank with you. The first time I started reading about pulmonary surfactant, the first line that is mentioned in every book says that your pulmonary surfactant basically helps in reduction of the surface tension. When I started reading it, I actually couldn't revolve my mind around what exactly goes into surface tension. Like, I had to go back to the basic physics of it and see that how exactly this concept of surface tension works when I'm talking in terms of pulmonary physiology. So I'm putting up two slides related to that so that it is very easy for you to understand. So this is the concept of surface tension. It's basically the attractive forces among the liquid molecules which is responsible for surface tension. So in short, what we are saying is that every molecule of the liquid exerts some equal and opposite pressure internally. Because of this, there is a spherical shape of the liquid droplet. Now, what we are saying is that whenever we apply a surfactant to this droplet, this surface tension is reduced, and as a resultant, instead of a single spherical droplet, this liquid will be spreading out. That is what we want in the lung also. So, as you can see, this the dewdrop, which is the best example of a single drop of water. So, this is the concept of surface tension. So, uh, practically, if you put a little surfactant over this, we should be seeing that drop spreading out on the leaf instead of being like a spherical shape. So, that is the basic idea of surfactant. Now, we know that the lung alveoli are coated with the surfactant molecules. So, what exactly does it help in? Is that it basically prevents the collapse of the alveoli on expiration, and because of this there is less pressure needed for the next inspiration. Now we'll see this. So this was the concept which I said, that before surfactant we have a spherical shape, but after surfactant, because the surface tension is reduced, we have a complete even spread out over the surface. This is what we need. Now, coming to the pulmonary physiology, as I said, this talk cannot actually contain all the things which are there in pulmonary physiology in a newborn baby, because it is too vast. But what we'll be doing is, whenever we are discussing individual topics, like say your pulmonary hypertension, that time we'll go on to the vascular development and all those things. Right now, when we are talking about a pulmonary physiology in the context of respiratory distress syndrome, what is important for us to know that what happens because of surfactant, and resultant what happens when there is a surfactant deficiency in the preterm baby's lungs. So this is the basic thing that we all know. We are not going over that. What we see here is the alveoli. So in the alveoli, we know that there is a capillary network around it. The major function here is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So as you can see, this is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. This is the blood. Now, what we know is that because this is blood, this is a fluid part, and this is the air part. So this is actually the air fluid interface. Now, a stable alveolar volume, this is depends on the surface tension at this liquid and gas interface, as well as the recoil of the tissue elasticity. Now, what we mean by this is that the best example that I can give you, normally I use this example whenever I am talking in terms of PEEP, which we provide for ventilation in the newborn. What you do is that whenever there is a completely deflated balloon and you try to inflate it with some air, you may have noticed that initially it requires a lot of pressure for you to inflate the balloon. However, next time keep a little air in the balloon and then try inflating it. The effort needed is much like decreased as compared to what the effort is required for inflation of a completely airless balloon. So that is the same idea, same concept which we use in terms of our alveolar inflation. So whenever there is a little, that is the concept of your residual volume, that is your functional residual capacity, what we talk about. There is always some degree of air which remains inside the alveoli, because of which the next inflation pressures requirements are very less. And this entire thing happens because of surfactant. If there is a deficiency of surfactant, at that point what will happen is that the alveoli will completely collapse. Because of this, the pressure required for inflation in the next breath is going to be much higher, and this is going to cause all the hemodynamic instability in our baby. So this is what we are talking about, a pulmonary surfactant. Now, pulmonary surfactant, what you need to know is a lipoprotein complex. So it consists of lipids and proteins. It is formed by your type 2 of alveolar cells, that is the type 2 pneumocytes which we discussed about earlier, and it has a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic region. So because we are saying that it lies between the interface of fluid and air, we have a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail to the surfactant. Now these are the components of a pulmonary surfactant. As we discussed, there are lipids and proteins. 90% of the composition consists of lipids and 10% are the proteins. Now proteins are your surfactant protein A, B, C, D, and maybe some plasma proteins also. In the lipids, what we have is, as you can see, a majority is called something DPPC, which is dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine, also known as lecithin. And the other lipids, when we discuss, we have our other phosphatidylcholines, phosphatidylglycerols, cholesterol as well. And each of them have their individual action. So as we saw, lecithin comprises around 60 to 80% of the lipid component of our surfactant, and the others are your phosphatidylglycerol and other phospholipids. When it comes to the surfactant proteins, which constitute around less than 10%, the most important protein we require is SPB, that is a surfactant protein B, because as you can see, this is the protein which is responsible for reducing the surface tension. The other proteins in the surfactant, like the A and D primarily, are involved in phagocytic and defense function. So if our baby has inborn deficiency of surfactant protein B, there is going to be complete all the features of respiratory distress syndrome, even if the baby is a full term. So that is why we say that yes, RDS is very common in preterm babies, but it is, though rare, not absolutely uh, impossible in our full-term babies as well. So this is the condition where it could be. The other possibility is when a mother is diabetic. So an infant of diabetic mother could also have RDS even in a full-term baby. So how exactly it works? This is, we'll just run through this. So as we already saw, the type 2 pneumocytes are responsible for formation of surfactant. By 20 weeks of gestation, there is something called lamellar bodies which appears in the cytoplasm of these pneumocytes. The lamellar bodies are further secreted by exocytosis into the surface lining between the fluid-air interface. And here the surfactant formation occurs as a meshwork of tubular myelin. So you can see, sorry, as you can see, this is the type 2 pneumocyte which we are talking about. And the type 1 pneumocyte, as I said, it helps in the structural and the metabolic part of the alveolar formation. Type 2 pneumocyte, as you can see, there are so in type 2 pneumocytes, as you can see, there are these lamellar bodies which are forming inside it. The lamellar body enter this space through exocytosis. Here they form the surfactant which actually occurs like a mesh, and this is the surfactant after it spreads out. So it has the hydrophilic head and the hydrophobic tail that we talked about. What happens after the work of a surfactant is done? Here these are the tissue macrophages, and this engulf the surfactant and it goes back as again a raw product for the next lamellar body formation. So this is how the cycle goes on. A half-life of alveolar surfactant roughly is around 5 to 10 hours after the secretion. And then, as we saw, the macrophages which are there in the alveolar space, they break down this surfactant and it is again reabsorbed in the lamellar bodies. So this was the entire life cycle of formation and the degradation of surfactant. So to sum it up again, what are the functions of surfactant? The first and foremost thing is that it decreases the surface tension. As it decreases the surface tension, and we know uh, that the atelectasis is not going to happen because the surface tension is just a second please. Yeah. So it decreases the surface tension. It prevents the alveolar collapse, that is the atelectasis of the lung is also prevented. It promotes lung expansion during inspiration, that is less amount of pressure is required for next inspiration, and it facilitates the recruitment of the collapsed alveoli. So this was the very nice picture which I found on net, but this gives you a complete gist of it. That is the normal expiration with surfactant, we know that even at the end of expiration we have a partially opened alveoli, but when it comes with the surfactant deficiency, what we are seeing here is that there is a complete collapsed alveoli. So the next inspiration is going to demand much more inspiratory pressures. So now, why are we talking about preterm babies? We already saw in our canaliculae and saccular stages of lung development. So everyone has this idea that obviously a preterm baby is going to be deficient of the surfactant. How deficient? That the storage pool of surfactant in a preterm baby is approximately 4 to 5 milligram per kg at birth, in contrast to a term baby who has around 100 mg per kg of surfactant at birth, which is a huge difference. So this is the reason why our preterms and why our preemies are actually more prone to get RDS. So as we saw what the surfactant does, obviously the opposite will be what surfactant deficiency does, that it gives rise to progressive atelectasis. There is a loss of functional residual capacity. Because of this, obviously it is going to lead to alteration in the ventilation perfusion ratios. There will be uneven distribution of ventilation as well. So this is what is RDS. Lead to alteration in the ventilation perfusion ratios. There will be uneven distribution of ventilation as well. So this is what is no. If everyone is fine, I think let us proceed further.
Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you.
Yeah. So now we come on to respiratory distress syndrome. But before that, the most important thing that we need to remember is that there are multiple causes of respiratory distress in a newborn baby. And just because a baby is preterm, obviously we know that the first differential is going to be RDS, but there are a lot of other things also which can be wrong in this baby, and we need to know about it. Do anyone want to be contributing to this? What are the different causes of respiratory distress that we have seen when a baby is getting admitted to us in our NICU? Uh, I'm sure everyone knows that whatever are the topics in the index of Flohati actually are the reasons why a baby gets admitted in NICU. Like that is what we used to think at the resident level. So, but funnily enough, the common things that everyone remembers whenever we see a baby with respiratory distress or you're asked with this question is obviously RDS. And as we saw, it can happen in preterm or the term babies, both, not necessarily preterm. But there are certain other things which also can occur. So we know that early onset sepsis can present as congenital pneumonia in our baby. We can have a baby who had meconium strained liquor and now has come to us with a meconium aspiration syndrome. Sometimes it could just be transient tachypnea of newborn, but though the main thing for to remember here is that this is always a diagnosis of exclusion. So first you thoroughly assess the child. If you need any investigation in terms of X-ray, if it is justified, then go for it. Uh, okay. The others are congenital heart disease. Your PPHN can present in that way. Perinatal asphyxia by itself can give rise to respiratory distress in our newborn baby. And there are a few other causes, like say your spontaneous pneumothorax, your pulmonary hemorrhage in the child, uh, a baby who is coming to you with a diaphragmatic hernia, maybe not antenatally diagnosed in the ultrasound. All these are the possibilities, and never to forget that one important possibility is the anatomic causes. Now this could range from right from your choanal atresia till your laryngeal web. You could have a baby coming to you with tracheoesophageal fistula and so on and so forth. So because it is a newborn baby,
Ma'am,
yeah, yeah.
we cannot see your slide.
Acha, slides are not visible. Just a
No.
second, let me see. Uh, Nothing is visible right now. Is it visible now?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Okay, guys, you please let me know initially. How many slides have you missed? I think we were okay till the respiratory distress syndrome part, right? And the discussion that we did on the causes of respiratory distress are the same. Yeah. So these were all the causes, and as we discussed, the anatomic causes as well. They are clear now, right?
Yes, we can see.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's focus on RDS, that is respiratory distress syndrome. As everyone knows that initially it was known as HMD, but now we don't call it HMD. That is a hyaline membrane disease. See, hyaline membrane disease was termed on the basis of pathology. So most of these babies were diagnosed in that stage where the hyaline membrane had already been formed, and most of them actually used to be beyond the point of salvage. But now that we have improved diagnostic as well as improved therapeutic modalities available with us, we call it respiratory distress syndrome, because it now very rarely goes on to the level of hyaline membrane formation. Second thing to remember is that respiratory distress syndrome is a syndrome of clinical judgment. So most of the times we may have to take a call on giving surfactant to our baby, or maybe starting on the non-invasive ventilation for the baby without even waiting for our x-rays. So it is a diagnosis of it is a clinical diagnosis. As we saw that the more premature a baby is, the more chances of RDS. So statistically, the incidence is around 60 to 80% in the infants who are less than 28 weeks of gestation. It goes around 30% at least between 32 to 36 weeks of gestation, and it is very rare above 37 weeks. As I mentioned, that a full-term baby coming to us with a respiratory distress, RDS will be in our differential diagnosis but weighed out. We'll be more thinking in terms of, say, your congenital pneumonias. We will be ruling out any anatomical abnormality if it is there in the child. However, if the child has a mother who was diabetic in gestation, we still keep RDS as one of our differential diagnosis above. Or there could be a previously affected child, or maybe some unexplained neonatal death, which may give us a clue on whether this could be a surfactant protein deficiency also that we may be looking at. So here with our X-ray and all those things, we will be getting a clear-cut idea. So now coming to the risk of development of RDS, as we said, it is maternal diabetes. Multiple births, yes, it has been linked to RDS. Normal vaginal delivery is found to be protective against RDS, at least in the near term, like late preterm babies. Birth asphyxia, any cold stress can actually worsen the RDS and a previously affected infant as well. The risk is low in pregnancies which have hypertension, that is PIH actually causes a reduced risk for RDS. Or the most important and the most like a research proven thing is the use of antenatal corticosteroid. So antenatal corticosteroid, we have 2-3 slides in the end, because by itself it is a very important thing, and whenever we discuss RDS, we cannot move further without discussing your antenatal corticosteroid use. It is the only proven thing which helps in which has been linked to reduction in the incidence of blood. So what exactly happens in this RDS? This is generalized atelectasis, though it is a progressive atelectasis. There is a ventilation perfusion mismatch, and there is subsequent hypoxemia, respiratory acidosis, and later on respiratory failure in this way. So when we see the pathophysiology of RDS, what we need to understand is that it is a progressive atelectasis. That is, whatever is the deficiency of surfactant to start with, that is at the birth of the baby, can slowly worsen over a period of next few hours. So when a baby breathes, there is some shear stress in the alveoli and the terminal bronchioles, because as we said, there is a atelectasis which happens because of the complete collapsibility of the alveoli and the opening of the alveoli. There is a shear stress which happens. Because of this shear stress, there is a damage to the lung architecture, because the lung architecture by itself is very fragile in these newborn babies. Because of this damage is the debris, which is the proteinaceous debris which leaks in the membrane. So this is what we talk about the hyaline deposits, because of which this disease was termed as the hyaline membrane disease. As and when the debris collects, this further impairs the function of the surfactant. So the surfactant deficiency progressively increases, and because of which, if not managed earlier, then we can have a respiratory failure or death in these newborn babies. So as a rule of thumb, the initial PEEP, that is because these babies don't have enough functional residual capacity, we do start on the TP's resuscitator giving enough PEEP from the labor room itself. Along with that, there are also a few concepts of giving prophylactic surfactant in the labor room, but what we generally follow is your early rescue therapy. We'll be discussing what those therapy means. I'm sure all of you must be aware of this pressure volume loop. This typical pressure volume loop, whenever you see, this is diagnostic of RDS. And this is what you are going to see whenever you ventilate a child. This is the pressure volume loop which you see on the ventilator graphics. What this means is that your x-axis denotes your pressure and y-axis denotes the volume. So as we can see, this is the normal lung. So this is the inspiration and this is the expiratory loop. So in the inspiratory loop, you can see that as we increase the pressure, the volume also increases. So much so that by this pressure, we have this much volume. That if increasing the pressure beyond this, in fact, there will be something called. So after this point, we have our expiratory curve. So a simple normal newborn lung. Now, when we are talking about an HMD lung, in fact, it's better to call it an RDS lung. What happens is that even if we are increasing our pressure so much, our volume is not going beyond a point. So because of this, first of all, there is a lot of barotrauma that the lungs have to bear. There is some degree of atelectal trauma also which happens because there is a continuous progressive atelectasis, as I talked about. So this kind of pressure volume loop is characteristic of your RDS. Now what happens is when you give your pulmonary, when you give an exogenous surfactant to this child, what you can see is that this loop actually is seen to be improving. This is especially important because initially we know that this is a RDS lung, so we do use a lot of pressures. We need very high PEEP, very high PIP for this babies. What happens is after we give our exogenous surfactant, the lung compliance increases. This is actually also called a compliance curve because it is change in volume, change in pressure. So the compliance curve actually improves. The lung compliance increases. So even with less pressure, the volume starts increasing. It moves upwards. What is important is that once we have given our exogenous surfactant, we do need to keep a watch on the ventilator graphics, because if this lung is improving, that is the point that we come down on our pressures very rapidly for this child, because otherwise the barotrauma is going to lead our baby into later on stages of BPD, and all those traumas will happen. So that is why we need to know this loop. Now, when we see the clinical presentation of our baby, now this baby who is coming to us, we are assuming is a preterm baby for right now, but even in term babies. So, what are the things that the baby will present with? First of all, obviously, we know there will be tachypnea. By definition, it is respiratory rate above 60. Sometimes it may be above 100 as well. There will be increased work of breathing, which will be seen by the use of accessory muscles of respiration in terms of retractions, nasal flaring. Grunt is a typical sound of the baby. I'm sure everyone must have heard a baby grunting some or the other time in life. Now, grunt is something that I am personally very, very scared of, because this is a very ominous sign. This is like a attempt from the baby to increase the FRC. So this is basically grunt means that the baby is expiring against a partially closed glottis. That is how that sound comes. This means that the baby is not generating enough functional residual capacity. That is, the PEEP is not there in the lungs, and this baby desperately needs PEEP. Most of the time with a grunt, we may directly decide to even intubate a child, depending on the other clinical factors as well. Sometimes the baby can come to us directly with a cyanosis, which says that the hypoxemia is quite severe. There could be poor perfusion. The child may just come to us with pallor, lethargy. Not feeding well could happen maybe in the first few hours of life itself, and apneas. So important to know is that depending upon the severity of the surfactant deficiency, we can have our onset of symptoms within minutes to hours of birth, and very severe cases can actually manifest in the first few breaths. Sometimes we may have a child with secondary apnea even in the labor room. With very, very premature baby, we have to be ready for all the management of the baby in the labor room itself. Now, I'm sure everyone knows about this score. If not, then please go back and do read about Silverman scoring. Some of you may be knowing this as Silverman-Anderson scoring. Now, this is the scoring for this is the clinical score for respiratory distress in a preterm baby. Corollary to this is, when you are looking into term baby, we have something called Downey score. Again, the parameters are there. Also, score is grade 0, 1, 2. So the minimum score is 0 and the maximum score is 10. But the parameters are different in the Downey scoring. When we are talking about a preterm baby, we look at the upper chest respiratory activity. The lower chest, mainly we are looking at retractions. We are looking at xiphoid retractions. Then we look at if there is a nasal flaring and expiratory grunt. And as I said, expiratory grunt is a very, very ominous sign. Please never leave a grunted for this baby. Now the SA score, when we calculate out of 10, anything beyond 3 to which lies between 3 to 5 maybe, the baby would be definitely benefited with some type of non-invasive ventilatory strategy that you can start immediately. If it is beyond 5, generally the child does require mechanical ventilation, which is invasive. Do a chest x-ray whenever a newborn has respiratory distress at birth or otherwise, because of all the possibilities that we looked at. However, in case of RDS, if you are sure that it is a preterm baby and it is completely in that phenotypical range, then we do go ahead with the management, even exogenous surfactant, even without waiting for the x-rays. But yes, chest x-ray is mandatory before giving your surfactant, and roughly around 6 hours after giving surfactant, unless there is a deterioration of the baby in between and you require to give other you need to repeat the x-ray or the blood gas to look whether a second dose of surfactant is needed. The other thing that you do is definitely an arterial blood gas analysis. Preferably with a preterm baby, most of the time we do put in the central lines when the baby arrives in NICU, so it's a good idea to get an arterial blood gas through there. Random blood sugar, yes, definitely after entering the NICU, because our dextrose percentage of fluid also will depend on that. Many of the centers do have a routine complete blood count done at the entry of the child itself, which serves like a good baseline as well. Blood culture will be done only in suspected cases of sepsis, like your early onset sepsis, and or a mother with say a premature rupture of membranes. To do echo in selective cases where we are more thinking in terms of either your congenital heart disease or maybe a PPHN kind of thing, but that will depend on the clinical features of the baby, say the femoral. So the we'll be looking at the blood pressures, the forelimb BP, the forelimb saturation. We'll look for the femoral pulses as well, and then take a call whether echo is needed. Otherwise, we first stabilize the baby and then look for the other investigations. Now, this slide I have put in because there have been a few studies. In fact, there is a 2014 good study which says that shake test has helped them in bedside determination of whether the child has a respiratory distress syndrome. That is, we are talking in terms of surfactant deficiency. So at least for theoretical sake, it is good to know what a shake test is. It can even be done on amniotic fluid, but here when we are talking about a shake test, we are talking about doing a gastric aspirate shake test. So basically this is done within say 20 minutes of, preferably within the first 20 minutes of birth of the baby, and the baby should not have been fed anything. Also, preferably we don't want to give any stomach wash or anything. What we do is that in a test tube, we take around 0.5 ml of the gastric aspirate of the child and 0.5 ml ethanol. The studies which have been conducted in the last few years have taken 0.5 ml of gastric aspirate mixed with 0.5 ml of normal saline, making it 1 ml, and then taking 1 ml of ethanol to it. So there are certain permutations, combinations which are possible here. What is important is after mixing ethanol to it needs to be given a nice shake for 15 seconds and allowed to stand it for 15 minutes for the interpretation of results. What we are looking at are whether there are any bubble formation on the surface or not. If we see that there are no bubbles whatsoever, that means that this test is negative. So will not say no surfactant, but a very, very deficient surfactant. If we have the bubble seen on the top of the fluid, that means there is some degree of surfactant deficiency. And if there are bubbles right across the surface of the fluid, that is a positive gas test, says that this child doesn't have a surfactant deficiency. So now these are the important things that we need to see, because I'm sure anyone who has entered the NICU has seen X-ray with RDS. But what I'm sure is that when you look at the X-ray of RDS, just a second, this is the picture that comes to our mind. That is a practically homogenic lung opacity. And we call this RDS, but it is not so. This is the stage 4 of RDS. So what we need to see are the salient features on the X-ray of the child, which doesn't give us a complete whiteout lung, but somewhere intermediately. So these are the stage 1, 2, 3, 4. So in the stage 1 of the chest X-ray showing stage 1 of the RDS, what we can see is, you're seeing the cursor, right? Yeah. So there is a slight granular pattern which you can appreciate. Okay, this is not, if you can compare it with the stomach bubble, you can see that this is absolutely black. This is the air. And if you compare it to this, there is a slight granularity which is seen. It's not a completely clear lung tissue. So there is a decrease in the transparency of this lung and no other symptom. As I said, still our clinical acumen could tell us that this is other. But yes, if you can see it very clearly, you can see a few lines coming over the heart shadow as well. Now, these are not very prominent because in stage 1 RDS developing. If you can see the stage 2, again the granular pattern is exaggerated here. Always compare it with the stomach bubble. The mistakes which has happened in this X-ray is that whenever you take a chest x-ray for a baby for any reason in an NICU, make sure that a nasogastric tube is always in and it reaches the stomach. Because first of all, it in the same x-ray you can look at whatever are the anatomic defects that we talked about, and all those things also get cleared in one go rather than subjecting the baby to multiple radiation episodes. Plus the stomach bubble is very clear, so it gives you an ease to compare with the lung fields. So as you can see, this and this is way different. This is a completely reticular pattern which we can see here. Though we can make out the mediastinal boundaries, we can make out the diaphragm. So this is stage 2. Now what is important of stage 2 are these lines. If you can appreciate, this is something called air bronchogram. Air bronchogram actually tells us that this is either a stage 2 or stage 3 of RDS that we are dealing with. So make sure that anytime you're seeing an X-ray with RDS, you don't just look at the lung fields, you look at the stomach bubble, you look at the lung shadow as compared to this, you look at the differentiation between the diaphragm and the mediastinal part with the lungs, and also you look at this. These are the air bronchograms, the fine lines of which you can see over the mediastinal shadow. Along with this, never forget to look at the peripheries, because sometimes you may have a small pneumothorax which has started developing. And obviously, you will be looking at the bony fields as well. So this air bronchogram is always a sign of alveolar lung reaction, and that is why this is the stage 2 or stage 3 of RDS that we are talking about. Now we go to stage 3, you can see that it is worse than stage 2. However, it is not as bad as stage 4, that is a complete whiteout lung. But this is definite, again, this is not a proper centralized film, definitely. But if I was there and appreciating this X-ray, what I would also be looking at is the thoracic ratio, because it does look like there is some degree of cardiomegaly as well. Not the upper part, because always consider that this part is going to have your thighs. So not this part, but you will be doing a cardiothoracic ratio and then taking the call. As you can see, the air bronchograms are very nicely seen here also. These are the lines. And the classical whiteout X-ray, which is a stage 4. This is a homogenic lung opacity. What is important is you can't make out the diaphragm shadow, you can't make out the mediastinal margin, the diaphragm margin at all, and the complete lung looks white out. Whenever you are looking at such kind of lung, here sadly we are missing the gastric shadow, but do compare it with the gastric shadow once, because that also tells you about the how focused the X-ray was, whether it is a properly focused X-ray or maybe an ill-focused X-ray. That has to be ruled out. So these are the radiologic features of RDS. Now, when we come on to the management of RDS, what we need to remember is that if anytime anyone asks you the question about how do you manage a child who is coming to with you with RDS, your first answer should never be a surfactant. Your first answer should never be ventilation. What we need to remember is that we look at the baby in totality. So whenever we have a preterm baby, most probably an extreme preemie, which is developing distress at birth, yes, definitely we do apply the TP's resuscitator. We do start on giving the PEEP then and there. But what is more important is that we are managing TABC. That is the first thing. Always look for is temperature. For extreme preemie babies, you may have to use a polyethylene bag in the labor room itself to prevent the insensible water loss. Also, you dry the baby. You don't want any degree of hypothermia coming in. You maintain a good hydration for the baby. 60 to 80 ml, which I have mentioned here, is a term baby. So for our preterm baby, generally we are looking at somewhere of 90 to 100, but also depends on the severity of RDS. With an X-ray showing a complete whiteout lung like a grade 4, I may be a little stringent with the fluid management in this baby. Again, the third most important thing, after stabilization of the child, we need to see that a proper nutrition is given to the child. uh, as we know of the term called IUGR, which is intrauterine growth restriction, what is now more concerning is something called EUGR, which is extrauterine growth restriction. We don't want that nutritional deficiency coming onto the baby in the initial few days of life, because we are not just worried about the weight gain of the child, we are worried about the total hemodynamic stability of the child. So in nutrition, yes, the baby is in distress, so we would like to keep the baby nil by mouth. As I said, before the first X-ray is taken, we'll be putting a nasogastric tube uh, and let the baby start the gavage feeds if possible, once the baby is stabilized. If not, and if the baby is very very preemie, then at least once the hemodynamic stability is achieved, we do start with trophic feeds for the child. uh, it's actually a vast discussion on trophic feeds, but what we need to remember is that some minimal degree of feeds are necessary to be given through a nasogastric tube to the child once the hemodynamically stabilizing occurs. In the meanwhile, what you can do for such kids is you start the parenteral nutrition. Either you can start a TPN, or at least a partial one, which is commonly done is by the use of your lipids and proteins from day one itself. Antibiotics will be given if there is a risk of pneumonia or if there is a risk of early onset sepsis. Now coming to the respiratory management. As we all know that the respiratory management in our newborns can be invasive or non-invasive. When we are talking about non-invasive, which is the choice modality now, we try to be away from invasive as much as possible. So with the non-invasive, we have certain modalities which are available. Now supplemental oxygen generally is not used in our extreme preemies, because there is no point in just giving oxygen to this child. What this child is actually needing is PEEP, that is your positive end expiratory pressure. So supplemental oxygen will be reserved to the babies who are comparatively late preterms, or say term babies who have inadequate oxygenation. Whenever a supplemental oxygen is administered uh, to the baby, we need to have a continuous monitoring. For all those who have attended the last talk on ROP, uh, you cannot forget at all that whenever we start a supplemental oxygen, or say give FiO2 in any other modality like your non-invasive or invasive ventilation, whenever you're starting any oxygen which is beyond 21% FiO2, you need to look at the monitors regularly and make sure that your target saturations are between 90 to 95, not beyond 95. You do tailor your FiO2 if the saturations are going beyond that. The second important thing is about warming and humidification of oxygen. And as we know, either oxygen hood, oxygen nasal masks can be given. The other modality, which is the most commonly used, is your CPAP, which is your continuous positive airway pressure. Now, the difference between your CPAP and your non-invasive ventilation or invasive ventilation, the NIV which we give, is that CPAP is providing a continuous pressure throughout the entire cycle of respiration. It is not like your NIV or say invasive ventilation, where you have an expiratory phase and inspiratory phase. Actually, CPAP gives a positive airway pressure throughout the cycle. So that is the PEEP that we give through CPAP. Now, nasal CPAP can be used early or to delay or prevent the need of endotracheal intubation, and which has been proved. Currently, the recommendation is that nasal CPAP has to be started for all the infants who are at risk of RDS, or those who are born less than 30 weeks of gestation. So here is the labor room T-piece resuscitator that we use. And there are various ways in which the CPAP can be given. That is, it can be through a nasal mask or nasal prongs. Even the endotracheal tubes have been used, but it's not such a good option to use a endotracheal tube CPAP. So this is the basic CPAP setup. I'm sure everyone knows that here we always used a blender so that we can tailor our FiO2 requirements as per the target saturations of the baby. Whenever you are giving the CPAP, the flow has to be adequate to start the bubbling. We have a humidifier here, we have an inhalational and an exhalational limb. The exhalational limb goes now, because this is a bubble CPAP setup, so the exhalation limb goes inside the water container. Now the level to which uh, this is dipped inside depends on what is the PEEP that we want to give to the child. Generally, to start with extreme preterm babies, we are very happy with the PEEP of say 5 or 6. Depending on the severity of RDS, we may have to go higher on the PEEP. By a rule of thumb, any PEEP requirement which is higher than 8, it's better to intubate your child and put on the mechanical ventilation. The newer modality which is available in the non-invasive ventilation is something called your high flow nasal cannula. Now you must have heard the term called HHH-FNC. This is nothing but heated and humidified high flow nasal cannula which we used. The good thing about this is that if you can see, the interface is very beautiful. So as you know that whenever we are applying CPAP to the baby, there has to be a complete seal. The disadvantage of using CPAP is that it is prone to a lot of nasal trauma, even to the root of the nose, even to the nares. So the high flow ventilation actually gives us some leniency because we need to keep it loose in the nose, and it's a very very beautiful interface, and the baby is very comfortable with it. Now there are still studies going on comparing nasal CPAP with the high flow nasal oxygen, but currently it is not recommended to be started as the first line, though the babies who are comfortable on it, comfortable on CPAP, can be taken to high flow nasal cannula as well. Now coming on to when do we use invasive ventilation in the baby, as we have seen that the non-invasive ventilation is beautiful now. So non-invasive ventilation has basically replaced the invasive ventilation in the initial management of RDS worldwide. Invasive ventilatory support will now be strictly reserved to very few patients. Which are these candidates? Either the babies who have received CPAP but are not doing that well on CPAP. If the respiratory distress was too severe to start with, as I said, our SA score of more than 5 or 6 are the candidates. If the respiratory efforts of the baby are very poor, what we need to remember is that whenever we are using a non-invasive ventilation, we are just supporting the baby. So the basic breathing mechanism has to happen from the baby's side. If we see that the respiratory drive is very poor, or if there is impending respiratory fatigue or failure, we do prefer invasive method of ventilation. Or if we have really really bad blood gas or recurrent apneas, it's a good idea to maybe ventilate the child. Now we see that these are the photos of ventilation. Do you see anything wrong in this picture? The baby is comfortable lying down. He's intubated, nicely fixed and everything. Is there anything wrong here? Do you look at the length of the tube? So what is also important is I think we are planning a session later on the various ventilation modalities also. At that time, these things are very important, that the tube has to be as small as possible so that the dead space is minimized. So these are the basic cares which have to be taken whenever we are invasively ventilating the child. Coming on to the surfactant administration, now the last two things that we have to discuss whenever we are discussing RDS is, one is exogenous surfactant and second is the antenatal corticosteroids. Now for exogenous surfactant, there are three ways in which we can administer it. It could be a prophylactic surfactant therapy, as I said, the delivery room surfactant. It could be an early rescue therapy, which is administered within 2 hours of each. But frequently, even before we get an X-ray films, we do go ahead with the exogenous surfactant therapy. And there is a modality which is called late rescue therapy. Now, late rescue therapy is not used anywhere. So when do we administer the surfactant? In all the three strategies that we discussed, they have shown to improve morbidity and mortality compared to the untreated child. However, when there were comparative studies done, it was seen that the early therapy is definitely better than the rescue therapies for babies who are less than 30 weeks of gestation. So we can actually go ahead with a surfactant therapy in the labor room if all your facilities permit it. The other better option is an early rescue treatment. That is, you shift your child to NICU and immediately give the exogenous surfactant to the baby. Coming on to which surfactant to administer, that is, what are the exogenous surfactants which are available. We basically have two types of surfactant. One is our natural and the other ones are synthetic surfactants. So natural surfactants are have been shown to be associated with an increased risk of IVH, though they were always grade 1 or 2 IVH. However, they still are the more desirable choice because of their availability, cost, as well as there are a lot of studies which have shown that natural surfactants are preferable to any of the synthetic surfactants which are available, because we don't have enough data on the synthetic ones. So there is a Cochrane analysis of 2005 which has also supported natural surfactant use. So which are these natural surfactants that we are talking about? As you can see, are Survanta, Neosurf, Curosurf, Infasurf. These are the basic available natural surfactants. As compared to this, we have synthetic surfactants which are either protein based, that is peptide containing ones, the Venticute and Surfaxin, and the non-protein moieties which are our Adsurf and Exosurf. What we commonly use is our natural surfactants. So this is an important table which shows all the important features of our natural surfactants. The Beractant based, which is Survanta and Neosurf, are more commonly used in most of the places. The other one which is also equally now being used is Curosurf, though there is a cost limitation to Curosurf. What is important to know is if we are using Neosurf, it has to be used as a 5 ml per kg. What is done is that all these surfactants individually have been given the quantity per kg to be given depending on the level of phospholipid inside it. Roughly, we need 100 mg per kg phospholipid to go in each dose of surfactant that we are administering. So Survanta gives 100 mg in this 4 ml and Neosurf gives around 100 to 110 in the 5 ml per kg. Then how to administer? The best technique that has been advocated is your Ensure technique. Now Ensure technique comprises of intubation, giving the surfactant through the tube, and then extubate and put on nasal CPAP. Now whenever we talk about Ensure technique, most of us do say that it is intubation, surfactant and extubation, but it is not so. Ensure actually comprises of all the four, that is the putting on nasal CPAP. Extubating to nasal CPAP is important inclusion in it. So the Cochrane 2005 also said that early surfactant therapy with extubation to nasal CPAP was associated with better reduced need for the mechanical ventilation as well as increased utilization of the surfactant therapy. So it was actually a Cochrane study itself has recommended it. How to administer, I'm sure this is the Ensure technique that everyone knows, that will be normally what we do is that we take our nasogastric tube and we cut it as per the size of our ET tube. We keep everything sterile. Post that we intubate our child. The tube is inserted inside the endotracheal tube and surfactant is given in aliquots, generally either 4 or 5 aliquots. Initially it was practiced that the baby was turned from side to side. Now it is no longer recommended. Your baby can lie supine and you can give it in aliquots. After each aliquot, just remove the you just remove the tube and you bag nicely. Again you insert the nasogastric tube inside the ET tube, give the second aliquot and again remove and bag it. So this is done as per the the total quantity of surfactant which is administered. Now the important question, once we have given surfactant, do we repeat the administration of surfactant? Now this is about the retreatment strategies. Now retreatment strategies are, there are a few babies who may require a second dose of surfactant. What is important to know that current recommendation says that retreatment should be considered if there is a persistent or recurrent oxygen requirement of more than 30%, and it has to be, generally we do give it around 4 to 6 hours of post the first surfactant administration, but if there is worsening or no proper improvement, it can be even done earlier than that. Otherwise, the commonly what is done is that we do an X-ray after 6 hours. We see how much the baby has improved. We look at the ventilator graphs and whether there is upgoing of uh, the pressure volume, that is the compliance loop, and then take a call. But generally, up to 3 doses of the surfactant can be administered. Now the side effects of exogenous surfactant again will depend on which is the preparation that we are using. The common ones that are seen are either hypoxemia or bradycardia during instillation. The endotracheal tube may be blocked. There could be some association with pulmonary hemorrhage as well. Now sepsis is associated as long as you are using complete sterile technique, generally not encountered, and it can very safely be given. However, there are definite cost limitations, because of which, as I said, Curosurf, which is one of the very nice and least quantity needed surfactant, can't be used because of the cost limitation. But all before giving surfactant, we definitely need to have a talk with the parents and then counsel them about the cost and then go ahead with the treatment. Now coming to the last part of our talk, a role of antenatal corticosteroids. Now antenatal corticosteroids by far has been the only modality which has been repeatedly evidence proven to reduce the incidence of RDS in our preterm babies. Now how do they act? Firstly, they stimulate the developmental regulated gene expression and they result in lung maturation. They also improve, that is they accelerate the development of your type 1 as well as type 2 pneumocytes. So as type 1 pneumocytes are increasing, the structural and biochemical changes will improve. Type 2 pneumocytes are increasing, because of which the surfactant will also increase. So it improves the lung mechanics and gas exchange. Also, it enhances the neonatal response to postnatal surfactant administration that has been found in a few studies. There are certain other effects also which occurs by antenatal corticosteroids. These are basically something which helps in the induction of your pulmonary beta receptors, which play a role in the surfactant release and the absorption of alveolar fluid. Also, it induces the fetal lung antioxidant enzymes, and it also helps in the absorption of the lung fluid which occurs after the birth, because of which the distress part clinically also improves. Now, which steroids are used? The commonly used steroids which are recommended are betamethasone or dexamethasone. So betamethasone, dexamethasone, both comparatively, betamethasone has very less mineralocorticoid activity and they are very weak in the immune suppression part also. Currently recommended dose is betamethasone will be 2 doses, which is given 12 milligram 24 hours apart. If dexamethasone is used, then it is a 6 mg dose, which is given 12 hours apart and for 4 doses. Now, if we have to see among these two, what are the preferable ones, then the recommendation says betamethasone, because dexamethasone has some additive part in it, which has been linked to uh, maybe a little brain developmental issues in the baby. So if there is a preferable option asked between the two, then it is betamethasone that we definitely prefer. So now coming on to our last slide, about the entire talk of today, there are certain important take-home messages that you'll have to take with you. So the lung alveoli, as we saw, were coated with those surfactant molecules. Surfactant helps in reducing the surface tension at that air fluid interface, because of which This will prevent the collapse of the alveoli on expiration, and it reduces the pressure needed for next inspiration. The major milestone in reducing RDS related morbidity and mortality in the neonates was the introduction of antenatal corticosteroids. Again, betamethasone and dexamethasone with these set doses are the steroids of choice. The antenatal corticosteroid, prophylactic or early surfactant therapy, and generally even the INSURE therapy, that is the non-invasive ventilatory strategy after the surfactant therapy, reduces the incidence and severity of RDS. Any use of oxygen therapy in a preterm neonate has to be monitored well, and we have to make sure that there is no hyperoxemic damage which occurs after this. The currently recommended target saturation, I'll say this 100 times if needed, but everyone has to remember that it is 90 to 95 in any preterm baby. The initial postnatal management will include a detailed evaluation of the infant and providing the warmth, management of fluid, nutrition, ventilatory strategies, as well as the exogenous surfactant administration in the child. With related to the exogenous surfactant use, we prefer the prophylactic or the early rescue modalities, which is any time better than the late rescue modalities. Natural surfactants are preferred to the artificial surfactants, and regarding ventilatory management, we have to be sure that we try the non-invasive ventilation. Unless those criteria for invasive ventilation are fulfilled, then we go for that. But otherwise, the preferable modality is non-invasive ventilation. Surfactant administration will be done through INSURE, which includes intubation, surfactant administration, and extubation to CPAP. And repeat surfactant doses can be considered in the infants who have RDS and they have persistent or recurrent oxygen and ventilatory requirements within the first 72 hours of life. Maximum 3 doses can be repeated. I think that should be it. Yeah. Okay. Anyone has any doubts related to your physiology part or say the RDS pathology or clinical part?
I'll have to read once for asking some.
Sure, sure. Yeah. So I think we'll just end our session then.
Ma'am, I want to ask about that CPAP thing.
Yeah.
CPAP is people, they recommend that when we make CPAP, we should make holes in that saline bottle that we make that handy CPAP that is there. So
Right.
that expiratory pressure, how do we regulate in a CPAP?
No,
How
see,
does it work? It's
yeah. So the first thing that we need to remember is that whenever we are the CPAP, which you're saying is the indigenous CPAP which you make, right?
yes.
So, however you try, it is never going to deliver definite optimum pressures. That is the first thing. Like we have used it in our residency, but now that we are working on the a little finesse levels, we know that the pressures, when we are talking about the pressure change, we make those pressure changes from 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter. Those changes are technically not possible in our indigenous CPAPs. Okay, so if you have given an option, always use the CPAP machine which is completely like cross-checked again and again about those pressure variations. The second thing is that, so that's why I will never recommend an indigenous CPAP machine. Though I know that we, in most of our government setups, we do use the indigenous CPAP machine depending on the number of CPAP machine versus the number of patients, right? So, when you're asking about the pop-up valve, right?
Yeah, the principle behind making holes into that saline bottle, and also sometimes when the baby cries, the bubbles are not there, or
Yeah. So see, the first thing is that the what at our stage we used to make was the use of our what we call the ICD bag. Okay, instead of the saline. That was what we have made indigenous CPAP long time back. What we need to remember is that it is never a complete closed system. There has to be some outlet because otherwise those bubbling is never going to happen. Okay, because otherwise there will be a pressure built up inside the whatever is your water containing source. There will be a pressure built up inside, and that will actually reflect in increased PEEP to the baby, which we don't want to happen. So there definitely has to be some degree of outlet. uh, so I'm not sure about the holes which you are saying where exactly they go, because it depends on what kind of indigenous thing is being made. But as a general rule, there has to be opening to it. The other thing is that whenever we are looking at the bubbles, see, a bubble CPAP machine has to have a bubble, because that is how we are generating those pressures. If there is no bubbling which is happening in the bag, then you look at a few things. You start from the baby. Okay, so what we look at the baby is whether there is any leak which is happening in or around the interface that you are using, either your nasal CPAP, like your nasal prongs, or maybe your nasal, the small mask which we use. So that has to be very not tight, but it has to be leak proof. So make sure that is happening. Sometimes a baby may be opening the mouth, and that is where the pressure may be releasing. Okay, so that we'll have to check. Preferably we want the baby to close the mouth, so that, now there are many technical things which have to be managed here, but that is how we manage it. The other thing is that you look in the tubings. If there is even a slightest opening in the tubing, see your tubing has been broken somewhere, burst somewhere, your pressure will be releasing from there, and because of that there will be no bubbling in the machine. The next thing that you look for is, and the tubing includes your inspiratory as well as your expiratory limb. You even look at your what do you say, the humidification part, whether there is any leak which is happening at that side. Even then the pressures will be hampered and there will be insufficient bubbling. Then you look at the bag. As I said, no, there has to be some opening where the pressure can be finally releasing. We don't want any pressure releasing till the time the tubing reaches underwater, but in the water compartment we need a pressure release, otherwise there will be inadvertently a lot of PEEP which will be going to the baby. If after all these things are proper, then look at your flow, because your flow may be actually less, because of which the bubbling may not be coming. So what you do is you actually tailor your flow to the point that the minimal bubbling is seen in the baby. So that is how you actually evaluate whether that CPAP bubbling partner that is done. And always make sure that your baby has the orogastric tube and it is open, because the CPAP kind of GI injury, the stomach injury, is really a bad injury. So make sure that the opening of the orogastric tube is open, and there is the pressure which is going should go only inside the lungs. It should not be actually causing your abdominal distension also. But most of the time, like say around 80-85% of the time or more, it is the interface, it is the nasal interface which is, there is some leak somewhere, because of which the bubbling doesn't happen. So we can't just be increasing your flow. You'll have to see these tubings and everything, and then if not, just see if your flow is less. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Anything else by anyone? No, I think we can just yeah.
Regarding surfactant,
Yeah.
what surfactant is actually better out of the ones that you mentioned? Which one is?
See, there is a vast controversy because of the cost issues. Okay, personally, if you ask me, I love Curosol. Okay, the main reason being that it is a very small quantity which has to go through the baby. We all know that our baby is say 1 kg, 1.2 kg or something like that, and when we give a 5 ml per kg, it actually goes like 6 or 7 ml of surfactant that I have to put inside the tube and bag it. So every time I will have to give say 1 to 1.5 ml and bagging it, right? For Curosurf, you need maximum is around 2 to 2.5 ml per kg. So the quantity, the overall quantity decreases. However, the cost is exponentially high. So it all depends on what we can go for. But currently, Neurosurf is a good acceptable option. It is a very good acceptable option. Only thing, as I said, no, that we look at our ventilator graphics, because NeoSurf has that specific thing that within the next few minutes or maybe an hour or so, there will be sudden improvement in the compliance of the lung of the baby. And if we don't look at the baby at this time, we may actually continue giving high pressures though they are not needed, and that will in fact traumatize the lung. So we recheck the baby in a few minutes after that, look at the ventilatory graphics. If we see that, as I mentioned, the beaking occurs whenever very high pressures are given, because the lung is completely inflated, we don't require pressures and we are unnecessary giving, that time that beak kind of thing appears, you may actually come down on your PIP or your PEEP gradually when this is happening. Also a good idea is even to come down on your FiO2, but first pressures. But NeoSurf is a good option. NeoSurf is acceptable if affording, then CuroSurf, definitely.
Another thing is it mandatory that we should look for desaturation every time we are administering surfactant? Is it necessary that every time the baby will desaturate?
Yes. See, it's
Always?
not about every time the baby will desaturate. But see, you have to understand the thing that you have an endotracheal tube down the baby's trachea. Okay. So the only way that the exchange of gases occur is through the endotracheal tube. The baby cannot breathe by himself. Right. So whenever you are putting the surfactant inside, and that's why I again said that whenever we are talking about CuroSurf or NeoSurf or whichever surfactant, the quantity also matters. Okay, because at a time, if I am giving 1 to 1.5 ml of NeoSurf inside the endotracheal tube of the baby, and then taking my time aram se to bag it, it is not done because the baby is not getting that air thing in that much period. Most of the time, the bradycardias, the apneas can occur even because of this. So what we do is we do go slow, we do go gentle, but we keep a monitoring thing. You can never even bag a baby and not connect the monitor, right? So when you're giving a surfactant, we have to look for those hemodynamic instabilities. And if you see that the baby is worsening very suddenly, you can actually stop the procedure in between, stabilize the child, and then again go for the procedure. But because we are blocking the only tube through which the baby is breathing. So until that entire procedure is done, we have to be very sure that the other parameters are also in line. That's why. But most of the time, it is a very safe and like easily done procedure as long as you are used to it. Yeah. Okay. I think if there are any more doubts or anything, no, you can just message out to us and then we'll reply back also. Yeah. Okay. Chalo guys, then I'll just end the session today. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.